Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for hanging out in the waiting room, and thanks for joining us today for our presentation by Dr. Alan Steele on his book, Santa Fe's Fonda, the story of the old inn at the end of the trail by the History Press. The book is available on sale on our website as well if you'd like to order a copy during or after the talk. I'm Melanie McWhorter, the Deputy Director for Historic Santa Fe Foundation. For those of you who don't know, Historic Santa Fe Foundation is located in Santa Fe, New Mexico on Canyon Road, and the offices, sala, and garden are now open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the governor of New Mexico has removed the mask mandate, so you're welcome to come in. We are still kind of on times we may start limiting the number of people who come in, or you're welcome to come and visit us now. And the gardens will be filling in as the spring season is coming along pretty quickly now. We're very excited about that. We are hosting an in-person opening this coming Friday for Anita West's show, Chairs, Telephones, Mailboxes, and the COVID Mutation Series. And that's on display from this Friday, March 4th until the 25th of March. And the opening is March 4th, 5 to 7, but Anita will be in the gallery from noon on, so you can stop on by and say hi to her. We're also having an online salon El Zaguan with Gary Fogel on his book called Skyrider, Park Van Tassel and the Rise of Ballooning in the West. And that's on April 19th at 3 p.m. You can sign up for that on our website at historicsantafe.org. And if you use the events menu, there's some of our upcoming events are listed there. And you're welcome to sign up for our newsletter to find out for upcoming events, because we are doing a lot of tours and other events for this summer as the weather starts to get warmer. Today, many of you may have noticed that you're joining without video or audio. We ask that you post any questions, and you may post during the talk as well. They will be addressed at the end of the talk. We ask that you post questions in the chat box, or there's also a Q&A, and I'll look at both of those at the end. And I'll read them out to Dr. Steele, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can within about our hour time frame here. So I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker for today. Dr. Alan Steele worked all his life in the communications media, first as a disc jockey at his college radio station, and then in managerial and administrative positions in international broadcasting networks. He has spent many years as a university professor in Australia and America. More recently, he has immersed himself in the history of the Southwest. Among his previous books was Santa Fe, 1880, Chronicles from the Year of the Railroad, records a most critical year in the history of Santa Fe when rapid change overtook the old city. He now resides in the city where he wrote about and enjoys the city's incredible history with visitors on his downtown history tours. And today he'll be talking about his newest book, Santa Fe's Fonda. So thank you, Dr. Steele, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be with you, and greetings to everyone. Before I start talking about this book with you, I would like to say how much I learned when I reread the book I wrote here. You know, once you get into the final phases, you forget so many of the things you included. And so there are many, many stories that we could easily go off on tangents in. However, I'd like to share some of the major stories with you this afternoon. And we start off with the pioneers of the Santa Fe trails. And of course, everyone thinks of William Becknell when you bring up the topic of the Santa Fe Trail. Becknell was residing in Franklin in the early 1800s, and through various acquisitions of land and other things, he became quite deeply in debt, and discovered all of a sudden in 1821 that he was in debt $1,000. That would equal about $25,000 today. And that was quite a large amount, of course. And even today, how could you quickly get $25,000 to pay back a debt? So he was in debt with about 5 different people who had loaned him money to buy property and other things. And he was worried about what he was going to do. And finally, one of his debtors, or excuse me, one of his creditors threatened to take him to court over the amount of money owed him. So he started thinking seriously about finding some way to leave town. And he was also thinking of how he could come into some money that would save his neck. And so he started planning a trip out west. He declared that he was going to have a trip out to trade with the Native Americans in this part of the world to get buffalo hides and other items. However, he thought there might be a chance that he could even go into Santa Fe. So he loaded up his horse and 5 of his friends on horses, and they started out across the prairies to the mountain country. And it was quite well known that if you were coming to Santa Fe, you just go general direction west until you saw the Rocky Mountains, the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. Then you would turn south to go down around the southern end of the Rockies, and that would take you into Santa Fe. This was general knowledge in those days. And so he traveled out, and the book is full of all the stories about his trip. And it was a rather peaceful trip, although they did have some difficulties at different points. Finally, when they got into the New Mexico territory, they were intercepted by Captain Don Pedro Ignacio Gallego. And he was from Santa Fe, the Santa Fe military unit. And he, surprisingly to Becknell and his friends, was very friendly. And he announced to them that Mexico had just recently declared independence. And now they were friends with the United States. Now, previous to this, anyone entering into Spanish territory in New Mexico or Mexico was quickly put in jail. They had no real hotels or inns. The jails became the inns for anyone who came in from America or from France or even England. And so this was the first time that they were welcomed when New Mexico became part of the independent Mexico. And so the captain and his team took them to San Miguel del Vado. This is a little small town east of Santa Fe. And it was important in those days because it was the best place to cross the Pecos River. There was somewhat of a ford there, and that was the easiest way to get on the track to Santa Fe. They arrived in Santa Fe on November 16, 1821. They had traveled 1,000 miles in 77 days. And so, rightly so, William Becknell has been called the father or the founder of the Santa Fe Trail. But I discovered there was another person who arrived just 2 weeks after William Becknell, and I call him the founder of the river trail to Santa Fe. Thomas James was a merchant in St. Louis, and in 1821, he met several men who had come back to St. Louis. They were merchants who had tried to go to New Mexico and do trading, but they were put in jail and they were incarcerated in Chihuahua City for about 10 years. And finally, they were permitted to come back to their own country. And James himself was also facing bankruptcy. And so he decided to go west. And he got a keelboat and loaded it with biscuit and whiskey and flour, lead and powder, items that he knew he could trade with the Native Americans on the way west, on the trip west. So he traveled down the Mississippi to not too far south of a little village called Memphis, where he could enter the Arkansas River. He traveled up the Arkansas past Au Poste. Au Poste was the first capital of the Arkansas Territory. The capital had just been moved to Little Rock, and so he continued on the river past Little Rock onto the Oklahoma Territory. Before he left St. Louis, he was informed that all the tribes were very friendly along the way, and indeed he had quite a time interacting with the Quapaw, the Cherokee, and the Osage. But in Oklahoma, the river became too shallow, and so he had to leave his boat, and he bought horses from the Osage rivers and continued on. And somewhere in western Kansas or early eastern Colorado, he encountered a Comanche band. And at first they seemed very friendly as well. However, it turned out they became quite menacing. And so he and his men were constantly staying awake day and night to protect the merchandise they had with them. And pretty soon, the Comanches started demanding and taking much of his merchandise, and they were becoming more and more menacing. And they thought this was going to be their last day. And in the afternoon, all of a sudden, a Mexican military patrol came up to the Indians and said, "Tabajo, Tabajo, these are white men, and they were to be saved." He asked the Comanches why they were planning to do badly to harm the men from America. And they said, "Well, we were told by the governor of New Mexico that no Americans were to pass through here." That was their excuse. But another Comanche chief, Chief Cordero, heard about the plight of James and his men, and he informed the military, and they came out to rescue Thomas James and his team. They were then escorted to San Miguel de Vado, just like Becknell had been, and they continued their trip into Santa Fe. They arrived 2 weeks after Becknell, and they stayed several months. And while they were in Santa Fe, James records that Chief Cordero came to visit them just to make sure that they were all right. And while he was in town, he lectured the government in Santa Fe that they were to be kind to any Americans who came. And Thomas James, unlike Becknell, who came and sold his goods and then quickly returned to Missouri, James continued on in the city for several months. And it was he who helped with the independence celebration. In February, the local government in Santa Fe decided they were going to finally celebrate the independence of Mexico, which had happened while the two pioneers were traveling toward New Mexico. And he was asked to, what should they do to celebrate independence? They'd never done that before. And so he said, well, you need to raise a flag. And he suggested a flag with a bird on it, probably a beautiful bird, but they decided no, they wanted to have a flag that had two hands shaking to show that they were now friends with the Americans. At any rate, the day arrived for the independence celebration, and the governor, James said to the governor, well, this is your duty to raise the flag. But he said, no, I don't know how to do it, you do it. So James says he was the person who first raised the new Mexican flag over Santa Fe. He stayed a while longer, and it's from his writings that we find most about what Santa Fe was like in those early days of 1820s. He was able to rent a house from Don Francisco Ortiz, and I call Ortiz the father of hospitality. He served as James's interpreter with Governor Malgares. He advised James several times on what was the proper protocol to use in working with the governor. He even offered his son to be a guide for James to go to Mexico. James was not doing very well financially, even in Santa Fe. And so he decided he would go down to Mexico to do some trading down there. The trip never happened, but at any rate, Ortiz was willing to help him. And as I mentioned, James led out in the independence celebration here in Santa Fe. And once they had raised that flag, the party went on all night in the Plaza of Santa Fe. So those are the three heroes of the Santa Fe Trail, in my view. There's another one who is a woman, and I'll tell you about her in just a few minutes. Some of these people who first came in the 1820s, early 1820s, tried to describe the city. Becknell wrote, "In a valley of the mountains about 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, the city is compactly settled. The walls of their houses are 2 or 3 feet thick, built of brick, and are uniformly 1 story high, having a flat roof made of clay." Now, I wasn't able to find anywhere where Becknell said where he stayed when he was in Santa Fe. However, here's a statement he made in his writings, and it gives me pause to think that he must have stayed in a house, or he was very well acquainted with them, because he said they do not know the use of plank and have neither chairs nor tables. Plank, of course, referring to a wood floor. So without being able to prove it, I'm quite sure he's also rented a house or a room. And this was convenient for the traders because they could live in the room or the house and also display all of their merchandise there. It was a convenient way for them to sell here in Santa Fe. James said about Santa Fe, "It's beautifully situated on a plain of dry and rolling ground at the foot of a mountain and a small stream, and the stream runs directly through the city. The houses are all flat on the roof." Another man who came to visit in 1831, Josiah Gregg, said the town is irregularly laid out. The only attempt at anything architectural are compactness, and it consists of 4 tiers of buildings whose fronts are shaded with a fringe of portales, the porches of the rudest possible description, and they stand around the public square. There he was speaking of the government buildings. In 1839, another interesting fellow came. His name was Matt Field. He was an actor from St. Louis, and he was ill in health, not doing well. His doctor didn't know what to prescribe for him, but finally he said, "Why don't you take a trip out west? It may do you a world of good." And so he said there, he described Santa Fe there within a half mile of the base of the mountain, a small spot of the vast green plain was dotted with low 1-story buildings, reminding us irresistibly of an assemblage of molehills. In 1822, Becknell made a second trip in which he brought wagons. The first trip was by horse. Now he had 3 wagons. And so this was the start of the thousands of wagons that would come across on the Santa Fe Trail. In 1824, 25 wagons set out from Franklin. In 1826, Charles Bent, whose name you may have heard in history here, headed a 25 wagon train, and he decided after his trip to build a fortress-like trading post at the Arkansas River crossing of the trail. And that's Bent's new fort, Bent's old fort. And that's up near La Junta in Colorado, a very interesting place. If you ever get a chance to see it, you must do it. And Field described what happened in Santa Fe when a wagon train arrived. He said routine life would carry on until it was known a wagon train was on its way. The arrival of a caravan from the States is both to the natives and transient residents an affair of much enlivening interest. Excitement grew intense as the cavalcade entered the town proper. Whips were heard cracking around the distant corner. The mule and oxen drivers tried to outdo each other with all the noise and commotion they could create. especially the cracking of whips and the yells at the patient animals that had brought them to the end of the trail. On they came, on up the street, and old and young, American and Mexican, all sorts and sexes, assembled at the doors and windows and in the street to witness the great procession. So there you have a colorful description. By the way, Matt Field did a lot of prose and poetry. And in this book, I decided to use a bit of his prose or poetry to open up each of the chapters. And I think you'll find them delightful. And I'd like to share a little bit about that with you at the end of this talk. By the way, in that 1826 wagon train headed by Charles Bent, there was a young boy, 15 years old, who joined, and his name happened to be Christopher. It was Kit Carson, actually. And Charles Bent will ask him, well, you want to go with us, but what can you do? And Kit said, I can shoot straight. And so he was hired on by the wagon master. There you see how the trail went. It's not a very good photograph, but it's from Frankfort over in Missouri out to Santa Fe, crossing what today are 5 different states. Here's the lady I was talking about, Mary Donahoe. Mary Dodson's Tennessee family and William Donahoe's Kentucky families moved to Boone County in Missouri in the late 1820s. And she married William, so they became William and Mary. And in 1833, with their child, they joined one of the caravans organized by Charles Bent, headed for Santa Fe. They rented what was called, or just became known as, the United States House, because that's where Americans always stayed when they came to town. And if anyone asks, where are the Americans? They say, go to the Casa de Estados Unidos, the United States House. And William did a lot of trading. He traveled around the New Mexico territory quite a bit, buying and trading. And that left Mary at the house, and she started renting out rooms. And so it became known as I said earlier, the United States Hotel eventually, while they were here. At the same time, the Donahoes were settling into Santa Fe, 800 miles south. Sarah Ann Horn was with a pioneer group from New York. Actually, she was from Britain, from London. And they had come around to claim land and start a new community near the Rio Grande. It was down in the southern part of what is now Texas, and Mexico still claimed territory east of the Rio Grande. Eventually, the Rio Grande became the boundary between Mexico and Texas. But at this time, it belonged to Mexico, and they were encouraging people to come and inhabit the area. And this was about the time of the Alamo, and Santa Anna's army was marching through Texas over to San Antonio. And as they were trying to make something out of the land they had chosen, they discovered it really wasn't worth much. It was mostly sand and cactus, not really good for farming. And so people in the group started leaving. Eventually, there were just a few left, and they said they were just going to leave as well. So as they were leaving, they encountered a tribe of Comanches, about 800 of the Comanche people, and they were taken captive for over a year. And Sarah Ann Horn had a husband and 2 children at that time, 2 little boys. Her husband was murdered by the tribe, but she and her 2 boys were taken as captives. And eventually she lost touch with her little boys, and she never saw them again, actually. The tribe finally, after traveling around most of Texas, started going north and ended up out on the plains just east of Santa Fe. And to her surprise, there were men there who were able to rescue her by trading beautiful horses and other items with the natives. And so she was rescued from the tribe. And she had no idea who these men were. Eventually, she found out it was William Donahoe who had organized her rescue. Now we come to another major story about Don Manuel Armijo. And I can tell you more about Matt Field and this event that took place with Texas. Armijo was from a ranch near Albuquerque, and he took advantage of an insurrection in Santa Fe to become governor. And Matt Field, as I mentioned, was the actor from St. Louis. And in 1841, President Lamar of Texas decided to claim New Mexico as Texas territory. And he was sure that the New Mexicans would be happy to be part of Texas. And so he started organizing a friendly group called the Santa Fe Pioneers. There were about 200 people to march up to Santa Fe and take over the place in a spirit of kindness and sincerity. And so they were expecting a wonderful reception. However, Armijo was able to round them up, and he marched them to Mexico City to be put in jail. And in the march, 40 of them died en route. Eventually, the survivors were permitted to return to Texas a year later. That was the first attempt by Texas to take over New Mexico. And then in 1845, not many years later, General Zachary Taylor was sent to Texas to claim Mexican territory east of the Rio Grande that I was just talking about. And when he tried to do that, the Mexican army attacked, killed several of the officers and their men, and that gave President Polk an opportunity to declare war. And that started the Mexican-American War. Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West entered New Mexico in 1846 to take control. Armijo said he had 6,000 soldiers ready to repulse Kearny's arrival, but in the end, there was no opposition to the Army of the West, and they entered without a gun fired into Santa Fe. There are two people who followed the army into Santa Fe, Samuel and Susan McGoffin. And Susan wrote a diary that has long been used to find information about Santa Fe in those days. Samuel, her husband, had been an ambassador of sorts to Armijo, the governor here, and had worked on him long hours to help him understand that he shouldn't resist the US takeover of New Mexico, and he was quite successful. The result of the Mexican-American War was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in early 1848, and it gave New Mexico and California to the United States. The McGoffins rented a house in the area of what is now the Fonda Hotel, and they also became the center of society. And Kearny appointed Charles Bent to be governor, and he hired Kit Carson to guide the American army to California. And thereby are a number of other stories that you'll have to read the book to get the details. So shortly after this, the hotel and Santa Fe were flourishing. With the army in town, the hotel became a focal point of social life. There was a new lessee of the hotel, Humphrey and Coulter, and it became known as the Exchange Hotel. Then there were new managers, Frank Green and Thomas Bowler. They seemed to be experts at running hotels, and the new lessees of the hotel went down to Chihuahua City and got a group of people to come and work at the hotel. And they also brought up Pancho's band, which apparently was main entertainment. They also renovated the hotel at a cost of $10,000. And it was Doña Tulis Barcelo, who was a frequent patron of the hotel. She loved to come and listen to Pancho's band. She became a grand dame of Santa Fe, and she ran a Monte Bank casino about a block west of the Plaza on Palace Avenue. And she, of course, is another story in all of this. So the Exchange Hotel got that name in 1849. There were new managers, Raymond and Wood, and stagecoach service was inaugurated between Independence, Missouri and Santa Fe. The overland stages came out. Wild Bill Hickok was a stage driver for a while. And his big deal was when he was coming down the slope into Santa Fe, he would let the horses go as fast as they could. And he'd hit the Santa Fe River in a big splash and then come into the dirt roads of Santa Fe in a big cloud of smoke and come to a screeching halt here in front of the La Fonda. I love this depiction of the stage. I found this in an old postcard in the La Fonda Hotel archives. So he became quite a name in Santa Fe. It was during this time also in 1850-51 that Bishop Lamy traveled out to become the first bishop of New Mexico, and eventually, while he was here, became Archbishop. Another story comes to us about the California Trail. There were two families in Keosauqua, that's in Iowa, in 1858, who decided they wanted to head for California. Leonard Rose was a merchant and Alpha Brown was a friend of his. So Rose agreed to finance the trip out to California, and he appointed Alpha Brown to be the leader of the wagon train. So they headed for New Mexico with 3 horses, 14 trotting mares, 6 mules, and 140 oxen and cattle. And then people along the way who discovered they were headed for California joined up. So it became quite a large wagon train. And as they were coming through New Mexico, the Roses stopped in Santa Fe and obviously stayed at the Exchange Hotel. And then they continued down to Albuquerque and headed out to California across New Mexico. And you have to remember at that time, there was no Arizona. Arizona came 100 years later. It was all New Mexico out to the Colorado River, which was the border into California. At the river, they were ambushed by the Mojave tribes at the Colorado. Several of the members of the caravan were killed, including Alpha Brown, their leader. And so the rest of them decided to turn around and come back. And so they came back to Albuquerque. The Roses were in Albuquerque for a few months. Then they were able to get funds from friends and relatives in the East. They decided to come back to Santa Fe and they bought the Exchange Hotel. Eventually, a few years later, the Roses had a successful trip to California. And that is an incredible story in itself as well. Then comes along the American Civil War. A major character in that event in New Mexico was Henry Hopkins Sibley in the US Army. He had fought the Mormons in the Mormon War in Utah, and then he came and fought the Navajos in Mexico. He was in the US Army and serving in New Mexico for some time. And he was from Louisiana. So when the Civil War broke out, he sided with the Confederacy. And he became a general. He convinced the president of the Confederacy that he could come up through the Rio Grande Valley and get all of the armaments that the Union had stored here. Then he would go up to Colorado and take over the gold and silver mines that were just developing there. Then he would launch out for California and he would claim all of the Southwest for the Confederacy. They desperately wanted an outlet to the Pacific Ocean. This is an interesting man. He helped design what became known as the Sibley tent. And it was a great tent. It's much like a teepee, and In his patent that he got with the U.S. Patent Office, he said it would sleep 20 men. He also designed a little stove that could be put in the middle that would keep them warm all through the night. And so he was quite an interesting character. He got an army together, about 1,500 men, headed towards Santa Fe with his army in 1862. And they had the Battle of Glorieta Pass. And that story is pretty well known among anyone, those people, anybody who studies history here at all. And as you know the rest of the story, you find out that the Union Army coming down that met them at Glorieta Pass actually was able to repulse them, and they returned to Texas. And during that time that the Confederates were in town, there was a man by the name of Charles G. Parker, who had been a famous wagon master, and he happened to be manager of the exchange at that time. After the Confederate Army left and straggled back to Texas, Charles Parker was fined by the local magistrates for selling liquor to soldiers. And so he hightailed it out of Santa Fe and went back to mastering wagons on the trail. Sibley was highly criticized for the way he conducted his troops. He had to face a court-martial, didn't know what he was going to do when he left the service of the Confederate Army. And the U.S. Army had agreed to buy the Sibley tents. They bought about 94,000 Sibley tents, and they were obliged to pay $4 for each one that they bought. So Sibley would have made quite a bit of money off of his inventions. However, since he joined the Confederate Army and not the Union Army, the U.S. Congress forbade those profits to go to him. So he died a pauper at his daughter's home in Virginia. The post-war exchange, there was a new management team. It continued to be a place where public social events took place. An interesting scene in 1856 was W.G. Parker leading camel down San Francisco Street in front of the Exchange Hotel. That was I understand, the last camel left from work being done to create the California Trail. The exchange was purchased by Thomas McDonald, John D. Baker, and this is at the time when General James Carlson ordered Kit Carson to remove the Navajos from their homelands down to Bosque Redondo. There was a man by the name of John Martin who found water in the desert in the famous Jornada del Muerte, or the dead man's travel, on the Royal Road down between Socorro and Las Cruces. And he was sure there could be water out there in that desert stretch of the trail. He was able to dig a well, started a cattle ranch and a stage stop. But after a few years, they decided, he and his wife, that they would rather spend some time in the city. And so they came to Santa Fe and they bought the Exchange Hotel. He became the manager and she became the kitchen director. By the way, this is during the time that the Buffalo Soldiers commenced serving in New Mexico. And in 1878, John Martin died in a hotel chair. And so a friend of his, a former Indian agent, John Ayers, was chosen to find some new owners for the Exchange Hotel. And there were many VIP arrivals during this time. General Lew Wallace became the governor, and he stayed in the hotel briefly. He had to replace Axtell, the governor, and Axtell had no idea he was being replaced until Lew Wallace came and showed him the letters from the president appointing him to be the new general. The first train arrived in February 1880, and of course that signaled the very end of the usefulness of the Santa Fe Trail. So the train arrived and the trail ended. During that time, ex-President Ulysses S. Grant and the current president at that time, Rutherford B. Hayes, visited Santa Fe. It was during the time also of the Lincoln County War and when Billy the Kid was captured. It's the time that the governor wrote a book called Ben-Hur while he was governor. And this is the time when Billy the Kid was incarcerated in the Santa Fe jail. In 1881, Abraham Staab, a very well-known entrepreneur and real estate owner, bought the hotel with his partner, Robert Longwell, who was doctor at the first hospital in Santa Fe. And Staab's big innovation was to add retail shops on the San Francisco side of the hotel. The hotel went under another renovation. The only problem was other hotels were showing up, Harlow's, the Grand Central, and the Palace. And this is when Sister Blandina Sigali was the head of the first hospital, the first St. Joseph's Hospital, the hospital in town, St. Vincent's. And these two men were partners in the hotel business for 14 years. The hotel was on its downside now, and they kept advertising it in the Santa Fe, New Mexican as the best located hotel. That's about the most they could claim. And they advertised rooms renting for $1.50 per day. John T. Forsha was hired as the manager in 1891. In 1895, Longwell sold his half of the partnership to a man by the name of Cartwright. And after 4 years, Cartwright sold his half to Staab, so Staab became the sole owner. And this was the time of the fledgling Fred Harvey Company and the Conrad Hilton startups. In 1907, Staab sold the exchange to Thomas Z. Winter. He was a local grocer, and the hotel became a boarding house in effect. The last days of the old Fonda were in the early 1900s. The hotel went from shabby to being an eyesore in the city. Some of the newer hotels had steam heated rooms, electric lights, and telephones, and the exchange couldn't keep up with that. And the city leaders started demanding that the hotel be replaced. And at the same time, there was enthusiasm for the distinctiveness of New Mexico's architectural traditions. There was an exhibit at the Palace of the Governors in 1912 called The New Old Santa Fe. They had a new vision to emphasize the historic preservation to stimulate tourism to Santa Fe. And by 1916, the city council finally threatened to condemn the hotel unless it was removed. And so in 1919, a few years later, there was a war bond sales event in the Plaza. And anyone who bought a $100 war bond could watch or maybe even ride in this World War I tank. It's a little difficult to see, but that's the only photo we could find of it. It was called the Mud Puppy. And every time someone bought a $100 war bond, the tank would go to work and knock down some of the walls of the old hotel. That made room for the new hotel, which started building in 1919 with a 200 subscription drive here in the city. The architectural firm of Rapp and Henriksen was commissioned to design the new building. And the firm had caught attention at that new old Santa Fe exhibit for the buildings they had been doing around the territory. The new hotel would feature an interior courtyard just like the old exchange, and balconies and vigas would project out from the walls. This was basically the beginning and the birth of the Santa Fe style. The new building was completed in December 1922 in time for a Christmas opening. In 1926, the hotel was purchased by the Santa Fe Improvement Company, a subsidiary of the Santa Fe Railroad, and it was leased to the Fred Harvey Company. I mentioned several times Matt Field. I'd like to share with you a couple of his prose and poetry. that I think are quite lovely, and you'll find them at the beginning of my chapters. And the first one, he described Santa Fe: bricks molded from prairie clay and roasted in the noontide ray. Large as stones of city halls form good, strong built walls, and trunks and boughs of cottonwood form gates and beams and rafters good. And then in another one, he said, he described coming across on the Santa Fe Trail. Now they are bridging o'er the stream to pass across each loaded team, throwing in heavy brush and grass to bear the wagons as they pass, to keep the skittish mules from falling and guard the sinking wheels from stalling, and double teams they still require to drag the wagons through the mire. Behold, with what a fearful pitch the lumbering wagon jumps the ditch. See how the frightened mules are staring, hear the whips crack and drivers swearing. And then another final one. Night now was closing rapidly, and in the eastern sky, the moon came peeping out, bathing radiance as the golden flood of light sank, fading behind the mountains. The vast prairies were folded away in a heavy mantle of gloom. Tinkling bells were heard no more. A crescent moon came smiling from the far horizon, and starry night succeeded. Santa Fe never slept beneath a lovelier night, and night never followed a more beautiful evening. So there you have some of the highlights of the book. I hope you are able to catch it somewhere and have a good read. And as I said, I could go off on many tangents from the many stories here, but I tried to stick true to the idea of relating it all to the old hotel, the old inn at the end of the trail.
Yay, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Alan. That was fantastic.
It's a
It was
privilege.
a really great presentation, and I'm sure a very condensed version of what all's in the book, because there was a lot of
Indeed.
information that you actually shared with us today. So how did you, I was going to tell everyone too there, if you want to post any questions, please do it in the chat box, or in the Q&A, either one of them. I'll check either one of those. So how did you do a lot of your research for this?
Well, it was a mammoth job of just searching for all the stories that I could find related to the little hotel. And that little hotel was never very large. It was, only had 10 or 12 rooms, but it had a lot of social areas where people could gather. Mm-hmm. And I think it became more famous as a social place than anything else. But yes, you had to go digging for stories. And fortunately, quite a few historians before our time now had put in little snippets about the hotel. So I had to go around gathering those up.
Was there, over the years, was there a lot of competition for the hotel? Were there other pretty well-known hotels around the town, or how did this rank kind of in some of those hotels?
Yeah, I'm quite sure this was the first hotel or inn in the city. As I mentioned, during Spanish times, you were just put in jail if you came into Spanish territory. And so, yeah, this was the first hotel, and it was the only one for 50 or 60 years almost. And of course, in the 1880s, other hotels started springing up because the tourism aspect of Santa Fe was really starting then. People coming from the East who were so curious about this ancient city out here in the West.
Well, we do have a few questions that are popping up. Of course, there's lots of thank yous, and what a great presentation that you have given everyone today. And one question though is, which I quite like this one as well, is there anything about La Fonda being haunted?
I think you're confusing it with another hotel.
I'm sure almost everywhere in Santa Fe is haunted.
It's interesting that the Staab family, S-T-A-A-B, Staab family, were involved with the La Fonda for so many years. And then Mr. Staab built a beautiful mansion for his wife that he had gone over to find over in Germany and brought her back. And that became later a hotel. It's the La Posada over there, on the corner of Palace and the other one. And so the most famous ghost in Santa Fe was Mrs. Staab, and that's of course another story. But as far as I know, not many ghosts in the La Fonda.
We have another question. What's the location of the trail swalls depicted in your talk?
Say that again, the trail.
The trail swalls? Maybe Pamela, maybe you, am I missing? I think it may be the where the trails are.
Oh, yes.
The location of the trail swall.
Yeah, actually on the
trail. Oh, yes, thank you. That's what I thought you meant, Pamela. Sorry, the trail ruts.
Uh-huh. Can you see the photograph on the screen now? That's one of the places that I took that picture up near Fort Union, and you can see right through there where the wagons came through. And there are places all over New Mexico and other states where you can see the wagon ruts that were followed by thousands of wagons. So there are many places where you can see that. Up on Museum Hill, there is a spot where they identified the ruts of the wagons coming into Santa Fe. So if you, next time you're up there, just go around the corner up at the top, and you will see a little sign that says this was the trail of the old Santa Fe Trail. Oh,
that's near the Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe?
Yes, up there on Museum Hill, up on the old Santa Fe Trail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we did have a talk with Fran Levine in December too, where she talked about the Santa Fe Trail. So, and she actually, if anyone missed that too, that is actually on our YouTube page. And she kind of shows one of the locations too, where people used to pass, kind of going to the Camino Real. I think this is the photograph that she shows, going towards Albuquerque, I believe. So do we have any more questions for Dr. Steele? We'll have one more pop up because we do have a few more minutes. Was there a particular family that owned the land that the original building was built on? I'm wondering if it is the Ortiz family.
Yes, it was the Ortiz family, and they had, relations who lived around them on this property that the La Fonda is on today. And so the Ortiz family, that was the first family to start renting out space to the merchants who came over, and they held it for quite a few years. Ortiz had real estate all over the territory in different places, and so yeah, I call him the father of hospitality on the Santa Fe Trail. And while I have the floor, I might mention I've had a great time with the La Fonda with this book. They're very excited about it. I had the launch in the Santa Fe room over there last Tuesday. And I've also created a new walk-in tour called the Old Santa Fe Trail Route 66 City Tour. And if anyone's interested, you can sign up at the La Fonda concierge desk. We're starting that in about a week's time from the La Fonda.
That's fantastic. How much is it for the tour?
$20.
And how long does it last?
Almost 2 hours. And
okay.
it's about a mile walk.
No, that's just like this talk. It's packed with information in a short period of time.
Exactly.
So you can't count it as your exercise for the day and your learning for the day as well. But yeah, maybe I'll come do that with you.
Sure.
That's fantastic to know. Maybe we can get a little group together and arrange something like that as well. So if anybody,
sure.
Anyway, well, do we have any more questions from the audience, the silent audience out there? What? I'll see if anything pops up, but I think this was fantastic. Thank you so much. It seems like you also have done some research for what I quite like in some of my history books too, is some kind of intriguing kind of humorous and sometimes controversial stories. You've got a few of those things threaded in there. And I like how your nice, modest tone that like might hide some of those things, but it seems like there's some intrigue.
Well,
So
I do believe in telling the history as accurately as you can and not try to hide things, you know.
mm.
So you've got to be a truist. You've got to just tell it like it is, I believe.
Yeah, well, good. Well, I think there's one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So Lucinda, who snuck in here at the last minute, she's got a question. So many people who set out on the trail due to bankruptcy. Do you know of John Sutter, later of California, who came here as a trader, also bankrupt?
He was having financial difficulties, but I'm sure he wasn't in the same difficulty that Becknell had. You know, he had to leave because he was going to have to show up in court, and of course that meant debtor's prison, and he was going to do anything he could to get away from that. So yes, there were many, and of course they would come. You know, there are reasons behind that I don't have time to go into. One of the main ones was the panic of 1819. That's an interesting story in itself. And so these people would come to Santa Fe with their merchandise, and they would go back wealthy people. It's amazing the amount of money they had here, and it seems like there was more coinage and silver available out here in Mexico than there was back in the US at that time. And the US had just not too much before, well, in 1800, had purchased the Louisiana Purchase. And so the country itself was still in a financial bind. So that also contributed to the problems of the people who were settling in the Missouri Valley and the Mississippi Valley. So there's a lot of background to all of this.
Well, I actually have two more questions if I can keep you for a couple more minutes.
Sure.
One was the Ortiz family the same Ortiz that started the Bouquet Ranch north of Santa Fe?
Oh,
Nicholas Ortiz the third.
I'm quite sure it was. I can't definitively say yes, but that's a big name in New Mexico history, and I'm sure they would be related.
And one more question, which is, I think, is probably a good one to end with. Does your book end at the sale of the hotel to Fred Harvey?
It was leased to Fred Harvey. I mentioned the company, the Santa Fe, what was it called? The Santa Fe company that bought the hotel. That's an interesting story too, and I'll try to do it very quickly. Out in California, there's a place called Rancho Santa Fe. You may have heard of it. The Santa Fe Railway bought property out there, a huge tract of land that had a eucalyptus forest. And they were planning to make railroad ties out of those eucalyptus trees. But they soon discovered that the eucalyptus doesn't stand up very well, like other hardwoods would. Eucalyptus is rather softwood. And so they abandoned their plan to make railroad ties there, and they decided to develop it as a community. So that's closely related to the Santa Fe Railway that was here. And the legal company they organized out there in California was the one that came and bought the La Fonda, and then shortly thereafter they leased it out to the Fred Harvey Company. So Fred Harvey and that was the beginning of what, and of course the continuing story about all of this is that book called Appetite for America, which is available anywhere too, and it's beautifully written. So that would be the rest of the story. So
thanks so much. Yeah, I know, like Edward Monte trying to get the end of the novel, huh? He's trying to get the end of the story.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Steele.
Right,
that was
pleasure.
really great. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we hope you can join us on April 19th for Gary Fogel's talk. And you're welcome to email me if you have any questions, melanie@historicsantafe.org. All right. Thanks. Maybe we'll see you on a tour soon.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.